Hello and welcome to this week's episode of your favorite D&D and RPG themed podcast, Mastering Dungeons. I'm Shawn Merwin here with Teos, not in the dark, Abadia.
I am not in the totality. I'm in the,
Yes,
I don't know, in the absence, in the,
in the absence of darkness.
yeah, sure.
Can that be?
On the bright
Yeah,
side of
I
the
am.
moon.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. I am in the path of totality here, and we record at 1 p.m. Eastern time, and by 3 p.m. Eastern time, it will be getting very dark around here. So we are going to get through this so I can run outside and stare at the cloudy sky uh,
Yeah,
for 6 minutes or however long that it's totally dark, and then I'll come back inside and record another podcast.
huzzah.
Yay! But we have some things to get to, non-eclipse things to get to this week. First, in our listener corner, we have Kurt Ugle 4576 via YouTube, who asks, how much of your game prep story and elements tend to make it into play? How much do you improvise to suit a scene?
Mhm.
Can you please talk about how to keep from getting frustrated when parts of your game prep don't get used, and how to not get too locked into your own expectations? I have learned to expect that none of my ideas are truly set in stone until they make it into play. But if I run multiple sessions in a locale, I may get a chance to try again, and players do love callbacks. And this is just a massive question
It's cool.
because certain people, aka Mike Shea, aka tons of people have talked about game prep, right? There's never
Yeah.
unprepared, uh, and books like that as well. And so it's a huge topic about how to prep, how to use the prep that you do. And so I have a few tips, but I'm not the best person to talk about this because for the most part in my games, I either am playing something I already wrote for a play
Mm,
test for a published thing, or running a published thing that someone else created, or I just take a vague idea that I have and I improvise on purpose so I don't prep because I want to
yeah.
see how it comes out. So, uh, before I get into the things that came to my mind, Teos, is there anything that you wanted to say in general about this
I
topic?
mean, probably the thing I'd say the most that kind of I think answers all of these things is run other games
Mhm.
because non D&D RPGs have very different senses of how structured or not scenes are. And my impression, for what it's worth, is that as I have opened up my D&D games to where there's more possibilities, that's where things go off the rails, if you will. But I mean, that's what I wanted. So it's not really off the rails, right? But they go out into, they diverge from any one thing you might expect and they surprise you. And that's great. But it means that whatever you prep may get not used. And so, like, we laugh about how during Tomb of Annihilation, I had this tavern thing that I was going to run that I was actually playtesting because it was part of Jungle Treks that I wrote with Eric Mengi. So I was playtesting and I was so excited. I had this like 3D tavern and that was sitting over there on the side. And that showed up like 3 times before we finally got to use it because they just weren't going back to town like I thought they would. And so that can happen when you have this thing that you want to drop in, but other things keep coming up. But that's not bad. That's good, right? As long as you're okay with the other part of it, which is, well, whatever they chose to do is improvisational and fun. And so you just go along with it. I'd contrast that with a game like Blade Runner, where I just finished running the first session of the second box set. Really good, really fun. And it feels really open in terms of play, in that a scene is clues and the players, or an NPC and the players. And what exactly we say to each other, I don't know what's going to happen. And so it's very improvisational, but the location and the prep is 100% in that I know they will go to most of these locations and there's not that much to prep. And so I just know the NPC, or I know the clues, and then the rest is riffing, right? So the more you kind of play other games, the better you get at handling those kinds of different situations, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, my first thought is it can help you not be frustrated if your prep doesn't get used if you enjoy preparing for its own joy, right? It's fun to think of options, and it's fun to, for some people, to build worlds or build stories that may never be used, but you have done something cool in doing just that. Along the lines of what Teos just said, prepare for the chaos rather than preparing for a specific plot. So sometimes we sit down
Mm.
and we're like, okay, they're going to do this encounter, then this encounter, then this encounter, and we want to make those encounters perfect. But what we should be doing is, if they do something like this is what I will use. If they do something like this is what I can
Yeah.
use. So
Yeah.
rather than trying to choreograph,
Mm-hmm.
uh, build tools, not statues. Right? Build the things that you will use, not the final version of what you think it should look like.
Ooh, that's great. I like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a in Dungeon World, there is a move, a DM move called exploit your prep. And that's generally what it means. It means be prepared for contingencies, not for specifics. Uh, if you do a lot of prep and you want your game to move in a specific direction, you can learn how your prep was used in real life.
Mm.
So as you experience these things, you can go, oh, every time I prep something like this, it never gets used. So I'm going to stop doing that. And what I really need is a chart of names. Or what I really need
Yeah.
is a list of monsters that might be found in this area. Uh,
Yeah.
so
That's
point your
smart.
prep in the right direction.
Yeah, that's really smart. And that's a great concept to review where you're going off the rails and whether, I mean, if it impacts you, right? And like I was perfectly fine with just having my terrain sit over on the side and my notes for that encounter. And whenever I got to it, I was fine, right? In the particular example I was giving of the tavern. But there are times when you can really feel like you want a particular set piece encounter to happen. And the truth is, like, if you're gonna do that, right? Like if when I set up like an enormous dwarven forge, red dragon at the end and pits and stuff, and it took me a whole bunch of time to work that, we're going there. I'm
Mhm. Yeah.
forcing the issue. I mean, that's what's on the table. That's what's going on. And it's not about the choice. There'll be plenty of choice in other times, but we're going
Yeah.
there. But so you kind of want to know how flexible you want it to be and then adjust your
Mhm.
prep accordingly based on what you're learning from all your sessions and your players, how much they zig and zag, why they zig and zag. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the final point, which is, what expectations have you created with your players? Uh, have you
Mm.
not trained them, but that's one way to think of it, is, do they understand that you have prepared this stuff, so you want to do this and they're okay with that? Then they're okay with you saying, I know that you want to go visit this, but I've really planned for this. Is everyone okay if we do that? There's nothing wrong with that for
Yep.
most players.
Yeah.
Now, if you pride yourself on being someone who lets the players do anything that they want, then that's harder for you to do when it becomes very important to do. So, managing those expectations, what's fun for the players, but also what's fun for you, is showing off this terrain that you bought and put together over several days of work. Uh, is it important that you visit that? And if it is, then visit that, like Teo said.
Yep.
So great question. A second question comes in from PT McKim via email. Email, is that stuff still around? Apparently. He says, I was fascinated by your discussion of exhaustion and hit points. I recently read some of Scott Fitzgerald Gray's Core 20 system blogs, and he mentioned his critical points concept is based on his old 5e homebrew of having critical points based on your constitution score. And there's a link in our notes to that blog. Since then, I've been playing around with that kind of grittier hit point crit system in which your actual con score is the serious physical damage that you can take on a critical hit or when hit points go to zero. As it goes down, your max hit point and con saves also go down. It's making it harder to restore hit points that add further gritty realism. Have either of you ever used a system like this?
Mm.
Uh, Teos, I will defer to you for the first part of this answer. Have you ever used a system like that?
Yes, sort of. In that at times I've wanted things to be based on how good you are. And seldom do I keep those systems for long because I find it feels strange to the players that, for example, the high constitution fighter took more damage than the wizard. And it becomes sort of strange. It's both strange, and the things that players will do about it will then depend, because the fighter might say, well, that's too big of value for me to do much about, whereas the wizard might say, I can easily do X and now I'm protected, or I've somehow made up for it because my number was smaller because it's based on me being weaker. So there's some danger with those things, and when I've used them, I've seldom stuck with it. Or let's say I've never stuck with it, really.
Yeah. So to explain what Scott's system is, and I read it, I tried to absorb it. It's not difficult. It's just I've got 10,000 things going on in my head. But what Scott's system does is it takes hit points and it breaks them down into two categories. You have critical points, which are the important ones, and then defense points. So defense points are the first things that go. This is the idea that when you take hit points of damage in D&D, you are actually not necessarily taking physical damage, but getting tired and defending yourself and taking blows that don't really leave wounds. Whereas the other half of hit points, the critical points, are the ones that show, yes, you are actually taking physical wounds, you are taking damage of a kind. And when you do that, what you can do is you can have not just a two-tiered system, but you can manipulate that two-tiered system. So you can say certain damage, like a critical hit, goes directly to your critical points rather than that hit point. So it's sort of a buffer with your defense points, and then the critical points are the real stuff. And you could play around, and you could do things like I just said. Critical hits will do critical damage. Certain poisons might do critical damage and avoid your defense points. So you could still have 20 defense points, but those critical points, when they hit 0, then you're in trouble.
Yep.
And so that's the system. I like it in theory, but I would have to play around with it because it's not just that. It's not just the points, but it's everything that goes into hit points. It's the when do you get them back? It's how quickly do you get them back? It's what are the consequences of losing one versus losing another? The simplicity of the normal D&D hit point system makes it very hard to replace because people are so used to it that keeping track of one thing is hard enough for some people. Keeping track of two things that sort of mean the same thing can add a cognitive load to certain players that they don't like. To other players, they might want 4, right? You have your temporary hit points and you have your this, and maybe you have the last one might be like your universal power, right? And maybe you only get 2 of those, and once one of them's gone, it never comes back, right? You could do lots of things and then have lots of interactions with those. The question is, what does it add to the game? And are players willing to go to that distance to get whatever it does add to the game?
This makes me, Scott mentions Star Wars D20 in his blog, and but what I actually kind of thought of and what you're just saying is Star Wars Saga, which had, I think it was called the condition track. I'm not entirely sure, but you had your hit points and then you had this track. And the track was meant to sort of capture things like other RPGs do, where it's not just the damage you took, but sort of how you've been worn down. But what happened was, I think that was like a, I don't know, 4-part system or something like that, or maybe it had a 0 and it could go up or down. I forget, but it only had so many steps, whereas hit points have a lot of hit points, right? A big pool of them. And what happens is that then when you now are creating a dual system where some things in the game tap into this other track, and they tend to just do like a point or so because you're trying to be careful not to do too much, but you're not watching it as carefully as the hit point dial, because that's like what 90% of your rules are addressing. So what happened in Saga was there were a number of ways you could just overwhelm the condition track beyond what the game expected and just automatically kill things, especially spaceships. And this was a problem when you could just, absolutely shut something down because you are bypassing those hit points. And so it requires a lot of careful planning when you create a sort of auxiliary defense system, right? And the same seems true of any game. Like, Blade Runner has resolve. And so if you're going to go and stress people too much, suddenly, oh, wow, well, they're down. What do we do now? Or they'll never go down because they did this thing and tapped into this feature. And so it becomes a whole nother set of playtesting you have to do, which I know Scott will do, but when we're doing it in our home games, it becomes a lot harder.
Yeah. And it's the reason why having monsters that damage ability scores is problematic. 9th level characters this weekend. 9th level characters fighting a couple of vampire spawn. Okay, they can handle that. But out of the alleyways come just a couple of shadows, right? Come up behind where the wizard's in the back. Wizard doesn't see them coming. Oh, they have advantage. Oh, doop doop. 2 hits. What's your strength? 8. Oh, if I roll double 4s, you 9th level character are dead because of 2 1/2 CR creatures.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of thing. Now, some people love that. Right?
Yep.
But for a game, that's not good. For the mechanics of a game, that's not good. So you have to be careful of exactly like Teos was talking about, of making the system work on a large scale.
It's worth saying it's super fun to do these things. So as long as you're in a campaign where players are going to be fun and kind and they're going to work with you, try out a system like this and then say, oh, look, you know what? There was a total eclipse today and everything goes back to normal. Just enjoy it.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I like is, I'm going to rave about the fate system more than once today. The fate system has something called consequences. So you take damage, you take shifts, they're called shifts of stress. And so if you take 5 shifts of stress, that's a lot. And you don't have hit points, but you have ways to soak up that stress. And one of the ways is called consequences. So you take 4 points of damage, of stress. You can say, I'm going to use my 4-point consequence box. Check that off. And now I'm going to write something that's true about my character because of this damage. Oh, the giant just hit me with its warhammer. Now I'm going to have the consequence of concussion. That's now an aspect in the game that can be used against me or for me if it happens to work out that way. So something like that is fun and it adds to the game as long as it fits into the mechanics, totality of the mechanics. That's just one way one thing that came to mind as I was thinking about this.
That's cool. Yeah,
so thank you.
Yeah, it's a fun question. I really dig it. And systems like that are really fun to play with. And I think if you want to get into system and game design, you want to play with things like this in your game and try things out, see why they work, how they work, and when they don't, and why they don't.
Right. One question you want to ask is, do you want the characters to always be getting stronger? Because right now in D&D, that's what happens. You take hit points, you take various kinds of damage, but it always goes away. And as the campaign continues, you're always getting stronger.
Yeah.
Do you want a kind of a campaign where at some point you may have a block of points that don't get stronger? In fact, you can never replace these 5 life points that somehow at some point may get go down until you're at 20th level, but you've only got 1 life point left. And you know that if that goes because of a spell or because of whatever your system does, that's the end of that character. Right. Now that could be fun, but that flies in the face of everything that D&D is.
And Keith Baker did that with Phoenix Dawn Command, right? Where he said, you have a certain number of times you can die. And dying actually accomplishes a lot of things, does these really cool things. So you kind of will at times want to die, especially when the game is made hard by the game master. You know, you will need to have some deaths, but you only have so many. So how do you want to go out? When do you want to go out? And that becomes a fun part of it. You're not getting more of those. It's always going
Yeah.
down, no matter how good your character gets over time.
Yeah. So great game design question and something to think on across all the games that we know and love. Speaking of things that we know and love, let's get into our news and commentary section, starting with live D&D at Madison Square Garden.
What?
What? Yes, Dimension 20 is going to do it. They have the actual play of Dimension 20, famously DM'd by Brennan Lee Mulligan. They will be playing a session at Madison Square Garden on the 24th of January, 2025. You can get your tickets by the time you hear this with the code word gauntlet at livenation.com. We've already seen Critical Role fill up a stadium in the UK, so why not bring it to the US with Brendan Lee and his crew?
That's pretty impressive, right? I mean, we saw how Critical Role did it, seeing Dimension 20 do this. I mean, Madison Square Garden, right? Like, okay.
Yeah. Now, is that the whole Madison Square Garden, or is it like a section? Do we know?
You know, I thought there was no way that Critical was filling the whole of a stadium in the UK, and apparently they did from all the pictures. So we'll have to wait and see how that looks. But yeah,
Okay. Because there's what we talked about this before. There's Wembley Stadium and Wembley Arena. And there's the stadium is the whole thing where the arena is just certain amount.
right.
So we'll keep an eye on this,
Yeah,
and we'll
you'll have
see
to see.
how many
I mean,
people attend to see a
yeah,
live Dimension 20 game.
it is just one night, but I mean, either way, that's amazing, right? Like this is not the Holiday Inn that we're filling a banquet room.
Yeah,
Which I know my live play would not fill. So it's all
true.
win.
Well, we'd be lucky to get 50 people. So here we go. We was it challenge accepted. Speaking from filling an arena to filling your nightmares, Rob Schwalb was on La Taberna de Rol, which
Perfect.
means what?
The role playing tavern, La Taberna de
Okay.
Rol. And this is a great interview. I mean, you and I, we love Rob Schwab. We've had him on the
Mhm.
show. And he comes onto La Taberna de Rol, which that YouTube, I've been on it, but far greater people have been on it. And they've said some really neat things. Like they have a knack, I think, of asking questions that really give the person space to just chat. And so they end up
Mhm.
sharing things that you haven't heard in other places. And this time it's Rob doing this on the interview. And he talks all about of course, Shadow the Demon Lord and Weird Wizard, his game that just is coming out now. But he goes back and talks about the history of 5e's creation
Mhm.
and what it was like on the teams, because the teams change. That's one of the big points he makes is, this team changes leadership. It goes from being from this person to that person to the other person. And that involves change. He talks about really fun things like Rob and Rodney Thompson go into a room and they just hammer out the proficiency bonus. And then they hammer out monster math, right? One weekend, Chris Perkins goes off, doesn't tell anybody, just takes that monster math and creates a spreadsheet with the basic stats for every single monster in the monster manual. Just
Mhm.
kind of like he went off and created Curse of Strahd. Like you just go off and do it, and comes back and goes, "Here's this," right?
Mhm.
Rob shares some really neat insights into what the core concept of 5e was, and I love this so much, right? Because we heard about the modules, right? Like the idea that D&D next was going to be modular, and if you like 4e, it'll be like this, or if you like basic, it'll be like this. And they worked along those lines, right? And so their idea was that the basic character class for 5e would function like a D&D basic or even original D&D character. Then modules would allow more options. So the design of things in 5e, like your feats, your backgrounds, your subclasses, those were all originally envisioned as this sort of modular concept. But that proved to be hard to implement, so it ended up being a single approach with some things like feats being optional. But I love that because it shows how even when they strayed from their full intent, right, of making these modules, the goal of making a game that was accessible to everybody, and he talks about that earlier, that was met because they had such clear goals in mind, right? So the game retains that simplicity of its design because at the core it is like D&D basic. And then you have all these
Right.
other pieces that are additional, but they're not intruding. They feel
Right.
complementary and additive, and you can grasp the one and then go on to grasp the next. I thought that was all fantastic.
Mhm. And that's goes to our Shadow Dark discussion, right? That's
Yeah.
why Shadow Dark is something that could be made on the bones of 5e.
Yeah.
It feels simple. It
Right.
feels like basic D&D,
Yeah.
but it still works mathematically because of that foundation.
Yeah. Great point. Yeah, and Rob talks about bounded accuracy, and he talks about sort of how it came up. Like apparently Mike Merle's like had this in mind very early on. He says, we were at Winter Fantasy in a hallway talking, and he was sharing this with me, what he thought how it would work. And Rob shares kind of what he likes and doesn't like about bounded accuracy. What are the problems in system design, RPG design when you have this, and what are the benefits, right? There's some really great benefits, but then there's some problems. So the whole interview is just fascinating. I love it. And he also shares his particular view on being part of a team like this, right? Like how does it feel to be on this team? Is it fun? Is it good? And he ends up kind of saying it's not for me, which I think is really interesting, right? But he's thankful for having been through the experience. So it's a great lesson. I highly recommend it.
Yeah. We've heard people on the team or near the team talking about sort of these questions, sort of the more gossipy things, right? Personalities and so
Yeah,
on.
yeah.
But for me, I want to hear what were the other options and
Yeah.
what are some benefits or drawbacks of the choices that were made or weren't made. So yeah, this is definitely
Yeah.
something that would be right up my alley. We go now to Chris Bissett, who wrote about encounter tables. Uh, Chris he has his brand called Loot the Room, and talks about how someone claimed that random encounters were exactly the same as the quantum ogre.
And
So what?
yeah.
Yeah,
Quantum ogre is this idea that if you go left or right on the trail, either way, there's an ogre, right? The ogre is going to appear, and there's no real choice. And so this idea of this sort of the random encounters wouldn't really provide you with any real choice.
and this quantum ogre trope is used as a curse. It's used as a negative thing.
Sure.
Which it doesn't have to be. We've already talked about how do you exploit your prop, uh, right? So it's not necessarily wrong as the game master to use a quantum ogre, depending on what the story and your players and everything. So calling encounter tables. I'm not a big fan of encounter tables. I think we've talked about this before,
Yep.
but I understand where their value is, and so Chris sort of shows how random tables are not quantum ogre, and they're in fact quite the opposite, right? The quantum ogre is you go left, you go right, the ogre's there.
Right.
This shows just a very simple chart, for example, of 1d6 encountering on a 1 to 3, 2d6 goblins that are hunting bears, on a 4 or 5, an injured bear, and on 6, Roland, the king of the bears, traveling with 1d6 armored bear retainers that are hunting goblins.
It's great.
And so each of those, first of all, will it happen? You don't know, depends on what you rolled to see if there was an encounter.
And it's
And
obviously a
then
very different story experience, right?
totally different experience, even within the same uh entry.
Yeah.
Because if you roll a 1 to 3, that's 2d6 goblins hunting bears. If you're a first level party, even if you're a 5th level party, there's a huge difference between 2 goblins hunting bears and 12 goblins hunting bears. One of them, in one direction, it could be a role playing encounter
Yeah.
for either side, right? If it could be for 3 first level characters, 12 goblins are going to not be easy. For a 5th level party with 6 players, 2 goblins are nothing. So that could easily turn into a role playing encounter where you, as the game master, say, what would these 2 goblins do versus what would these 12
Yeah.
goblins do? And then, of course, Roland, King of the Bears, with 1d6 armored bear retainers hunting goblins is a whole other thing.
Yeah.
So in that case, reactions, surprise, starting distance, all of that makes for a very different encounter, even with the same very short, very small table.
Yeah, it's a really fun write up and a really nice exploration of both the topic and then just
Mhm.
also of what an encounter table can be like to be so story rich yet totally different. And what I love about this is you don't actually need any text here to tell me what's
Mhm.
going on.
Yep.
The encounter table alone actually tells me a great story that I can build upon. No
Mhm.
matter what result I get, I can play off of it. And
Mhm.
that's such genius. Like I really love this because I don't like encounter tables either. We've talked about this. Not that I never use them, but I generally don't love them. Because I always like a good story, and here this is one I can sign off on because I know what's happening, and I can play off of it in a neat way. It really does actually do for me what a lot of people say counter tables should do for you, and
Mhm.
here I feel it. And I just love that concept of like when you actually think about this encounter table, even when I get an injured bear twice in a row, the reactions, the starting distance, the whether it's their surprise, this all does add to variability,
Mhm.
and it could actually still be interesting to have two injured bears in a row, especially because you know as DM what's going on, so you can play off of that. One of them might be injured in a trap, one of them's got a spear sticking inside, right? So those two things can be very different and cause the players to really get interested in all of what's going on. It's great.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean the difference between a bear with one hit point left lying on the ground versus a very large and angry bear with only one hit point gone is a
Yeah.
completely different story.
Wow.
So, and it shows, it shows the care that you can take to create these things and the utility of them if they are done well, as opposed to just 1d4 orcs, 1d4 ogres, 1d4 ghouls, right?
Yeah.
And that's it.
This is really one of my all-time favorite encounter tables that I've seen in the last few years. And we also talked about when we looked at Rime of the Frostmaiden, and they had that interesting system where based on the dice you're rolling, you were reflecting the probability that they were in a avalanche or
Mhm.
storm, ice storm conditions. And I thought that was super clever design too, where one roll is really telling you two things, and that was really neat as well. And
Yeah.
both these ideas are great to steal and use as DM.
Mhm. Let's go to our creator and crowdfunding corner. We're going to start with Jeff Stevens and his product Infestation at Devil's Glade for 5e. Tell us about this, Teos.
Yeah, the town of Devil's Glade is under attack. There are swarming insects that have driven the residents out of their homes and businesses. Giant insects patrol the town square. It's worth them when the eclipse is going through your town. Who or what has brought these creepy crawlies to Devil's Glade? And of course, this is a Jeff Stevens adventure. It isn't just that there's some infestation, there is more going on behind the scenes. The why of it is fun. And so your players will enjoy unraveling that mystery. It's a 2 to 4 hour adventure designed for 4 to 5 characters of first to fourth level, optimized for level 3. There are scaling suggestions, so you can play it even all the way to fifth to sixth level. Um, and it sounds really fun. Take a look at the Kickstarter page. Infestation at Devil's Glade will take you there if you search for it, or we have it in our show notes. And Shawn, what do we think about Jeff?
I love Jeff. And Jeff made a big announcement recently that he has quit his day job and has become a full-time RPG publisher. So congratulations, condolences, and good luck, Jeff. We're on your side, in your corner, and we hope it goes swimmingly. We also have a Fantasy Age 2E free quick start from Green Ronin. You can get that new free quick start at their store at greenronin.com or on Drive Through RPG. Uh,
Yeah, I always love their quick starts. They're really nicely done. If you're ever curious, like what should a good quick start look like, they often have really nice ones. And it's a great way to see like what is this game like, and what could I learn from it. So check it out, and you'll see kind of all that drives Fantasy Age as a unique RPG fantasy system.
mhm. And last but not least, there are times when I'll see something and I'll go running to the show notes to add it. to see Teos either has already done so or is in the process of doing so. And that
And vice
happened
versa.
today with this. Ethan Yen asks, what if you did it all with just hit dice? So Ethan is a supporter of our show, and maybe missed the April Fool's window with this simple one-page game that he has up on itch.io. So you take this, Teos.
Yeah, sure.
Tell
I mean,
us
so
what he
he just
says.
he asks this question, right? What if hit, well, he says, I think hit dice are underutilized in D&D. What would happen if the game was just hit dice? Oops, all hit dice. And he makes a one-page RPG out of this concept that you can take the rules and fold it up to build a dice tray or set it into your dice tray, and look at the rules while you roll in the dice tray. Because what you're going to do is players and DMs are going to throw dice into this dice tray, and it's in fact intended that you will chaotically, smash into each other's dice, changing the values so that there's oh no's and yays as you do this. The values are going to get compared, and this is going to result in foes or PCs being eliminated or taking damage, depending on how many hit die they have. And when you win and when you beat an encounter, you are going to each PC is going to get a hit die. And PCs get to choose classes. Classes have slightly different hit die sizes and hit die benefits. So the wizard can kind of cast spells based on what hit die is rolled, and the cleric can choose when to roll. And there's some different fun things like that. It's a fun read. I don't know to what extent Ethan has super made this into a fully fledged play tested game, but as a creative idea and something fun that you can just click on and check out, you should totally do that.
Yeah, I haven't gotten a chance to read it all the way through, but I saw the concept. I'm like, okay, this is cool.
It's really
I could
cool.
see
Yeah,
this.
it's fun.
I could see this turning really ugly really fast with some groups as dice are thrown at 200 miles an hour.
I want to see if he
into the
drops
dice
this
tray.
into one of his 5e adventures. He's written some really fun adventures, and if he throws
Yeah.
this in there, that's the kind of thing the players go, wait, what are we doing?
Mhm.
You're reduced to
You
only your
can
hit
check.
dice.
You can check that out at Ethan Yen yen.itch.io/hit dash die. And all other Ethan's stuff will be there as well. So that is our news on this eclipse day.